Hi, I'm Rachel here with my cat Leia, and I'm doing my April reading wrap-up. I read 6 books last month, and I thought I'd talk about them in chronological order. The first book I finished was The Photographer's Wife by Suzanne Joinson. It takes us back to the 1920s during the British Mandate in Palestine, when the young daughter of an English architect is privy to some dark, imperialist, violent sort of secrets. Years later, as an adult on the brink of World War II, she has to confront them again. This book was especially innovative for me because I've never read a book about Jerusalem where Jews aren't major characters. They're on the periphery here, but the main conflict involves the anti-British Arab underground. One of my main criticisms of this book is that it doesn't focus enough on its titular character, Eleonora, who is somewhat controversially married to the Arab photographer Khaled Rasool. Rasool is not so secretly involved in the underground, and one thing I think Joinson could have been clearer on is whether or not Eleonora was his ignorant wife, or perhaps had some Arab nationalist feelings herself, as the climax of the story implies. But instead, we focus a lot of attention on the architect's daughter and Eleonora's old lover, William Harrington, a pilot hired to take aerial photos of Jerusalem. There's a lot of drama about people's personal pasts, and a lot of the politics are at a bit of a remove from the story, though ultimately we are witness to some pretty gory British repression of Arabs, so trigger warnings for that. Joinson's descriptions of people and places can be lurid and beautiful, but in general, I don't think there was a lot of character growth, and the story was too unfocused. I was interested enough when the climax rolled around, but the overall product fell a little flat. Next, I'll talk briefly about The Jump Artist by Austin Ratner. I've reviewed this book more fully in my 2011 Sammy Rohr Prize reads. The Jump Artist won for Best Emerging Novel that year. This story is a dramatization of the real-life photographer Philippe Holzman. Before he got famous in the States, he was hiking in the Troilian Alps as a young man in the 1920s, and was wrongly imprisoned for his father's death, the reason being anti-Semitism. The book delves a little bit into the hateful attitudes in pre-Holocaust Austria, the European Jewish community's attempts to rally to Holzman's side, and a bit about his life in Paris after he was freed from his imprisonment. But ultimately, this is a story about how Holzman deals with the post-trauma of his imprisonment and his complicated feelings about his father. It's a moving read. From there, I moved on to poetry to celebrate National Poetry Month. I'm trying to expand my reading genres, and it's been a while since I've dabbled in poetry. I'm a bit rusty, and it's not really my strongest area, so I decided to go with this collection of Emma Lazarus's poetry. Americans should know about her from the final lines of her poem, The New Colossus, which are, give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. I was particularly drawn to her as a 19th century Jewish American poet. Later in her life, she began to embrace Jewish causes as the pogroms raged in Russia. She was a big believer in protecting the refugee, obviously, and her poetry shows that she saw America as a sort of promised land where we could break free of the bigotry of the old world. I wrote an entry on my blog where I dissected her poem 1492, famous for being the year of Christopher Columbus's discovery and also the expulsion of the Spanish Jews. Lazarus wrote a whole bunch of other romantic poetry and was in contact with some of her contemporaries of the day. Poetry wasn't a tool for her to do something else, it was the goal in and of itself. I connected to her Jewish poetry, of course. I don't necessarily feel very strongly about the rest of it, though perhaps if I keep my poetry streak going, I'll feel differently in the future. My biggest complaint about this particular volume is that I thought that the editor, John Hollander, was too negative and defensive in his opening. Next, I return to the familiar Jewish Jerusalem that I know from fiction. This is The Extra by A.B. Yehoshua and translated by Stuart Schoffman. It involves a childless middle-aged woman, Noga, moving home from abroad while her mother tries out an assisted living program. Noga grew up in Jerusalem, a city that is rapidly blackening, which is code for becoming more ultra-Orthodox. They're into the big black hats. In her normal life, Noga is a harpist at a Danish orchestra, but in Jerusalem, she takes on temp work as an actress working as an extra in various performances. Oh, and there's also some drama with her ex-husband, who always loved her but wanted kids. She didn't. I believe that Yehoshua meant this to be an examination of a woman's choices about leaving home, leaving a marriage, not having kids, yada yada, but it didn't really come through for me. I loved a lot of the individual pieces, kind of like vignettes, exploring the draw to classical music, the work of being an extra, dealing with your Haredi ultra-Orthodox neighbors, and the family drama about who cares for your aging parents, all very intriguing to me on their own. Not so much the melodrama with the ex-husband and the long, tedious chapters about their reunion one morning. Also, the novel was so Jerusalem-focused that it was quite jarring to return to the foreign orchestra in the last couple of chapters. I also had a problem with the writing. It was really purple. I'm kind of wondering if this is the fault of the translator for translating Hebrew too literally, because some of the endearments in dialogue are so long and elaborate they don't fit the English. Though I'm not sure if they fit the Hebrew either. It could be a writing choice to be so overly swooning. I don't know. I'm thinking of doing a video soon on translated fiction, so I'll leave it there for now. Another book that had potential, but didn't get all the way there for me. Next, I have an audiobook, so I'll insert a picture here. And I Darkened by Kiersten White. This is a YA alternate history that imagines Vlad the Impaler as a teenage girl. Volume 1 covers her father leaving her as a hostage at the Ottoman Empire, and all of her years there. So I call this speculative fiction. I'm drawn to it in the ways that I'm drawn to occasional YA fantasy about strong female characters and their journeys throughout life. Lada is meant to be an anti-hero, and I appreciate that. I was drawn to one of Kiersten White's interviews where she said she wanted to explore how people justify violence, and she made it sound like she wasn't justifying the violence herself. So, complex characters, maybe not meant to like. It's also refreshing to focus more on Romanian history and the history of the Ottoman Empire, rather than the usual Tudor-inspired fantasy worlds. We get enough in this action-packed novel to understand that this reality is complicated. Lada and her brother Radu narrate the story, but they both have very different reactions to their homeland and to the Ottoman Empire based on their particular drives and experiences. I was drawn to Radu's need for a religion where he could take part in learning, and also Lada's frustrations as an exile and in a sexist world. Obviously, Lada is a tomboy to the max, which is fine, but I do wish that White had focused a little more on how traditional women might wield power. It was kind of on the outskirts, but not really fully realized. Fiona Hardingham was the audiobook narrator, and her harsh pronunciations were sometimes jarring. That being said, I'll probably stick with this format for the next 2 books, just because of the genre. It's a YA novel, and there's romance, but I think that people might find this refreshing. It doesn't stop the plot. Lada and Radu's feelings for Mehmed are completely tied to the political realities that surround them and what they want for themselves within the world. It's a fast-paced read with evolving characters and stakes. It definitely scratched my itch for this type of fiction. And finally, I have Legends of the Californios by Raquel Perez. I picked this up from an independent bookstore in San Diego this summer. Always exciting to try something out that is relatively unknown. It's published by Outskirts Press, and I wrote the first review on Goodreads. This book tells 3 stories about Hispanic people living in San Diego under Spanish and Mexican rule of centuries past. The first 2 stories are paranormal romances, and they work decently well for me. The last story was more of a straight-up soap opera and didn't do much. Perez's writing was very amateur. She didn't handle anything with nuance or subtlety. Characters were always shouting at each other, or speaking with tears in their eyes, or changing the subject in conversation before the narrative told you that they were changing the subject. Still, the first story about ghostly vengeance spooked me out enough that I wish I hadn't read it right before bed. And I'm definitely now more interested in San Diego history, so that's a plus. And that wraps up April for me. I linked my monthly newsletter down below, where you can find my written reviews for all of these books. My newsletter also includes other literary geekiness, like bookish news, a reading meme, and more, so check it out. Happy reading, everyone, and happy May! I'll see you next time.